Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our public lecture of this series. My name is Dr. Rupert Reed, the convener of the series. It's been a pleasure having you with us during the last several weeks. If you've missed the earlier amazing installments, then do give them a watch after this. The links to those videos are in the chat and will be placed there again in the course of this evening. This series has been about whether there is an upside to down, whether sometimes bad news can be good news, whether breakdown can sometimes be breakthrough. And today is a pretty symbolic day in thinking about that kind of question. It is, of course, exactly a year today that the UK finally, too late, entered into its first lockdown. And for over half of the last year, we have been locked down, as we are, of course, still this evening. So it's a highly appropriate moment at which to be reflecting upon whether there are lessons we can learn from past disasters to carry them through to future disasters, on whether there are ways in which disasters can yield fruits and benefits, silver linings, despite their horrors. And this evening, we're going to be focusing on that with a special angle on the biggest potential disaster of them all, which of course is already underway, the climate emergency. And I have with me this evening, we've got a changed format from usual. I have with me this evening a couple of colleagues from UEA, an archaeologist and a specialist in climate adaptation, who are going to share with me the platform this evening, and we're going to discuss as a panel these matters. The way that it's going to work is that I'll speak first. I'll kick us off with some short remarks. I'll be followed by Nick Brooks and then Joe Clark. We will debate among the three of us for a while. And then, of course, we will go over to you for a long period of Q&A and discussion. So, in order to make a start here this evening, I want to first note to you the title that we have for this evening's special public lecture, namely, Can We Adapt Transformatively to Climate Decline? Why did we use the provocative phrase climate decline? Well, we used it because the three of us are all agreed that that's a pretty realistic description of what's going to be happening. We are past the point at which it's possible to nip this vast crisis, the climate crisis, in the bud. And that's why, as I'll explain in more detail in a minute, it's essential, it's necessary to undertake adaptation to the damage that is already present and the worst damage that will be coming, namely climate decline. So we're talking here about what my colleagues and I in my think tank Greenhouse a few years ago called facing up to climate reality. This was the first time that I wrote about the concept of transformative adaptation. And it's super exciting to have Nick and Joe with me here this evening, because we're all academics who have sought to pioneer a journey down this absolutely crucial route. And what's also quite fun is that we all live very close to each other, actually, in the same neighborhood. And so a little bit of this journey that we've been on together over the past several years, we've been able to do literally by walking up and down our local streets, being in each other's gardens and so on, and talking about it there. So what you'll hear this evening is, among other things, a sort of precipitate of a years-long debate and discussion that's already been occurring between the three of us. So hopefully in that sense, you're in good hands. All right, let me get underway with, as promised, my own take on this issue. And I'm going to come at it by asking a series of questions. And the first question I want to pose is, why is transformative adaptation necessary? And I've already hinted at my answer to that question. The reason is because, sadly, it is too late for an approach to the climate emergency based upon mitigation and prevention alone. Mitigation is the technical term that is used in the climate literature for reduction of emissions. And of course, that remains absolutely essential and should be focal to our efforts going forward. But it is too late for an approach which focuses primarily, let alone exclusively, upon that. We are into the period of serious climate damage now. We've been in it already for the past few years. We've seen global weather and our own weather here start to spin out of control, and climate disasters start to mount. This is a process which is going to continue. It is time for adaptation as well as mitigation. But what is absolutely crucial is to get that adaptation right. And I'll come in a moment to what that means. But firstly, before I get to that, let me ask a second question. Why isn't adaptation higher up the agenda already? If it's so clear, as I've claimed that it is, and I think my colleagues will agree, that we are now into the period when adaptation is absolutely essential, why isn't it already being discussed more? Why isn't it already being done more? Why isn't it already higher up the agenda? And my answer to that question, my main answer to that question is this. It's because contemplating the need for adaptation and enacting adaptation requires one to be honest about the need for adaptation, self-evidently. And that is something which people are finding very difficult to do. That kind of honesty, that kind of facing up to climate reality is still beyond the capacity, it would seem, of most people, most governments, most movements. Most still cannot bear to face this bitter climate reality. Thus, even though adaptation delivers better results, selfishly speaking, than mitigation does, the main benefits from mitigation are diffused worldwide and way into the future, while adaptation offers rapid and geographically local paybacks. So you would have thought people would be queuing up to do adaptation. Even though adaptation delivers better results, selfishly speaking, than mitigation does, it is still getting far less airtime and support, because to really go seriously into adaptation requires going seriously into climate honesty. And the world is only just getting to the point where it's ready to do that. Now that takes me to my third question. What is adaptation? What kinds of adaptation are you talking about? Are we talking about here? And I'm going to mention three kinds. At one end of the scale is the kind of adaptation which has most commonly been spoken of and implemented so far, which is called incremental adaptation. Step by step, bit by bit adaptation, responsive, reactive adaptation, incremental adaptation. At the other end of the spectrum is a new kid on the block, what is called deep adaptation. It's at the other end of the spectrum because while incremental adaptation tries to keep our current system going forward, deep adaptation claims that the collapse of our system is inevitable or probable or at least likely. And deep adaptation says we need to start preparing for that. What we're talking about this evening is not particularly either of those. What we're talking about this evening is transformative adaptation. Incremental adaptation is insufficient and indeed largely counterproductive, just insofar as it tries to keep the current system staggering forward, and just insofar as it is in fact bad from a mitigation perspective. So an example of incremental adaptation would be hard flood defenses, of which you need more and more in an overheating world, if that's the route that you're going to take, trying to protect yourselves in the form that you're used to against that coming world. But that's an illusion. It's an illusion that we can keep our current system going as it is without some kind of dramatic change. Deep adaptation embraces that dramatic change, but some would say that it goes a little bit too far. My own view is that deep adaptation is absolutely necessary. It's crucial as an insurance policy, but there is a risk that it could involve giving up prematurely on the chances of not collapsing our system. What we need, in my opinion, above all, as well as pursuing deep adaptation as an insurance policy, is transformative adaptation. Transformative adaptation keeps mitigation in its true sense alive and aims high, it aims to prevent societal collapse, while also providing us with insurance against that collapse. Transformative adaptation transforms our society in the kind of direction it needs to be transformed in anyway, and could even, despite the enormous pressures that we're going to be in over the next generation or two, could even deliver us in crucial respects a better life. So that's my take on what we're going to be, on what our central topic is for this evening. Transformative adaptation is the kind of adaptation that, above all, we need. That brings me to my final question. What are transformative adaptation's objectives? So as I understand transformative adaptation, I'm sure we'll be discussing this among the three of us in the next 45 minutes or so, it needs to involve thought leadership to take us collectively out of the climate quagmire that we're in. And it ought also to involve visionary actions to seek to model what transformative adaptation could be. This is absolutely essential for the sake of our society, for the sake of our children. This is essential to build community resilience. Transformative adaptation ought to model what governments ought to be doing and assisting, but mostly are not doing. So to bring my own remarks here towards a conclusion, the concept of transformative adaptation was initiated by some academics and then taken up in the United Nations. Nick Brooks, who will be speaking in a moment, was an early thought leader in this area. And I've contributed along with colleagues in recent years, as I mentioned earlier. And this is all good, but mostly so far, this has been at the level of academia, of some government action, some discussion from think tanks, etc. It hasn't been something which has been widely discussed, let alone made into a central topic in civil society. My take on the concept of transformative adaptation is that it is much too rich and too good not to make it real. This concept must not be corrupted or greenwashed. It is what we need for our time. It is the next coming thing in relation to the kinds of changes that climate decline is initiating or unleashing upon us. In other words, my belief, and I think this is the belief of my colleagues here this evening, is that it is clear that transformation is coming. We can either embrace that reality by engaging in transformative adaptation, or we will find our systems swept aside and the transformation that occurs will not be a particularly pleasant one. Transformation is coming. Let's make it the good kind. And a very final remark from me. What the implication of this is, and one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this topic to these UEA public lectures, is that transformative adaptation is far too good a concept to allow to remain within the purview of academics and governments alone. It needs to be far higher up the agenda of humanity. And that means it needs to be embraced by civil society. So transformative adaptation, far from being something which should remain in an academic cloister, or even something that could be rolled out to some extent by policymakers, needs to be something which is taken up by civil society. It needs to become a part of the movement which we've seen sweeping the world in the last few years with the school climate strikes, with Extinction Rebellion, with the Sunrise Movement, and so forth. And so my hope, among other things, in bringing this topic to this public forum here this evening is that maybe this can be part of the early stages of that process. Perhaps it is possible that transformative adaptation, a concept which I've briefly argued is so necessary for our time, can start to enter into the public discourse, can start to be taken up by civil society. It ought to be a central demand of citizens and movements, especially as we go into the vital climate conference, the climate COP this autumn in Glasgow, right here in the UK, an absolutely crucial moment in the history of humankind, nothing less than that. So my hope in bringing this topic here to us this evening is that transformative adaptation is a concept and a practice that deserves to be and can be taken up by the public, and is therefore extremely suitable for the topic of a public lecture. Okay, that's my intro. I'll leave it there and I'll hand over to Nick Brooks, who will take it on from here. Nick.
Thanks, Rupert. So I'm Nick Brooks. I have a background in climate science, but for the past 20 years or so, I've been working on issues around adaptation to climate change as both a researcher and a consultant. So what I'd like to do now is to try and sort of ground this discussion a bit more in terms of where we are with climate change and place this in something of a longer term perspective. So in 2015, the world's governments gathered in Paris and agreed to limit global warming to no more than 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial values. But despite this, it's currently likely that we'll exceed the 1.5 degree threshold around about 2030 and the 2 degree threshold sometime in the 2040s. Even if all countries meet their current pledges under the Paris Agreement, warming is still going to exceed 2 degrees C, as far as we can tell. But actually, most nations aren't on track to even meet those commitments, and so current projections of warming by the end of the century are heading towards around 3 degrees Celsius. Perhaps a little less, but these are middle range estimates and there's a lot of uncertainty, so we can't rule out a warming in excess of 3 degrees by 2100. So to put this in perspective, it's time to start looking back at some past comparisons. At the height of the last ice age, some 21,000 years ago, global average surface temperature was somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius lower than it has been historically. So we can say that the projected 21st century warming is around the lower end of the range of warming we expect coming from the depths of an ice age into a warm interglacial. But there's a crucial difference in that what's happening now is that we're driving warming some 50 to 100 times faster than we'll see coming out of an ice age. So this is actually an enormous change. Of course, the ice age world was a very different world to the one we're used to, and a 3 degree warmer world will be a very different world again. What we're effectively talking about here is large changes in landscapes and ecosystems, essentially the large-scale reorganization or reconfiguration of the global climate. And critically, from our perspective, this is going to be associated with large changes in the distribution and availability of key resources, principally water and productive and habitable land. So we might already be seeing the early signs of these sorts of changes. We're seeing severe droughts and associated wildfires in parts of the United States, Australia, Southern Africa, and the wider Mediterranean region. And these may be harbingers of future shifts to much more arid conditions. Drought and deforestation in the Amazon may be a precursor to transitions from forest to savanna. In other locations, sea level rise, changes in rainfall, increases in storm activity, and melting ice are already amplifying flood risk. And in fact, an increase in the likelihood of multiple simultaneous climate-related disasters, droughts, fires, and floods, for example, is a hallmark of climate change that's been described in a lot of the literature. So these disasters have the potential to cause large-scale humanitarian crises, but also to disrupt food production, supply chains, and to influence food and other commodity prices in a way that our current just enough, just-in-time models will find very difficult to cope with. We're going to need a lot more resilience and more redundancy in our systems, but our current approaches tend to trade this for economic efficiency. Now, one especially worrying impact of climate change is the potential for the occurrence of fatal combinations of heat and humidity in certain parts of the world for warmings above about 2 degrees. Now, a number of papers over the past few years have highlighted this risk, particularly for Western and South Asia. We're not talking here about heat extremes that are dangerous for certain vulnerable groups, such as the elderly and infirm. Rather, we're talking about combinations of heat and humidity that are physically unsurvivable by human beings in areas that are home to hundreds of millions of people. So how do we adapt to these sorts of threats? Are we talking about the radical redesign of urban environments? And if so, what about rural populations? Are we talking about the temporary or permanent relocation of potentially hundreds of millions of people? And if so, how do we even begin to think about these sorts of problems? So these and other changes are going to alter the global landscape in terms of where we can live, what economic activities people can carry out, and so on. In other words, as the global climate and environment reconfigure themselves, so we will need to reconfigure our own patterns of settlement, production, and wider economic activities. So in many parts of the world, transformation, as Rupert has said, will be compulsory in some form. And climate change will change our societies through its direct impacts. But I think it's important to recognize that our societies can also be profoundly changed by the very adaptations that we choose to respond to these, or that we don't choose. And we can see how this can happen by looking back to the past, to previous episodes of rapid and severe climate change, when past societies have undergone their own transformational adaptations. Now, an area that Joe and I have worked on quite a lot is essentially the Archaeology of Adaptation. Now, the last time the global climate reorganized itself was between about 6,400 and 5,000 years ago. And this period was characterized by a number of century-scale periods of extreme climatic disruption, so it wasn't a smooth process. And one of the most profound changes we see during this period was the desertification of the Northern Hemisphere subtropics. So prior to about 6,000 years ago, the desert regions of Africa, Asia, and North America weren't desert. They were well-watered savanna, and in some cases open woodland. And the archaeological records from these areas reveal how people adapted to desertification and the disappearance of resources. We see a lot of evidence of migration, the abandonment of settlements, and changes in livelihoods. In some locations, people became more sedentary, but in others, they became more mobile, shifting in and out of herding and farming livelihoods, for example, depending on local contexts and local environmental trajectories. And the coincidence of large social transitions and cultural fragmentation, for example, with episodes of severe climatic disruption during this period is really, really striking. Now, a recurring theme in the archaeological record of this period is the concentration of people in areas where resources were still available in wider regions that were otherwise experiencing climatic and environmental deterioration. So in these locations, societies became more organized, presumably in response to the need to manage and allocate dwindling resources. And strikingly, it's in these refuge areas, these refugia, that the world's earliest civilizations emerged, not, as we've been taught to believe, as a result of abundance and progress, but more likely as a response to scarcity. It seems that civilization, in the form of cities, states, and centralized political authorities, originally may have actually emerged through a process of adaptation to rapid and severe climate change. We might even characterize it as resulting from a series of measures of last resort. And indeed, one of the key trends we see at this time is an increase in social inequality as societies become more complex. So it wasn't all roses. And the art from these contexts seems to reflect an increase in the importance of ideologies of power and authority backed by violence, for example. So looking at the archaeological record from this period is very informative. It challenged our assumptions about the very nature of human civilization, but it also provides us with evidence of how societies have transformed themselves through technological and social innovation, while at the same time illuminating the darker side of these transformations. So our predecessors during this period didn't have the benefit of foresight based on a scientific understanding of the global climate system, as we do, and their responses weren't planned. So the question is, can we use the foresight that we have to both mitigate the risks of climate change and plan for its unavoidable impacts, to envisage futures that are both possible within the constraints of now inevitable warming, but also acceptable to us as human beings? What radical changes might we make to our societies, and how will we try and minimize the potential negative aspects of these transformational adaptations? So there are probably more questions than answers there, but we can dig into those in the discussion. So to sum up, what we can say is that transformation is coming whether we like it or not, again, to reiterate what Rupert has already said. And we can choose whether to bury our heads in the sand or whether to confront what is coming and ask how we can make the best of it. And to do the latter, we need to start planning now for a post-2030 world in which we breach the Paris temperature thresholds. And this is something that I think is sadly lacking amongst the international organizations and national governments that are working in this space. Again, as Rupert indicated, it is all very, very incremental, and I do a lot of work in this area, so I see this all the time. We need to be ready to go beyond these incremental approaches that are, again, designed broadly to preserve the status quo. And we need to step outside of our current decision-making frameworks that privilege considerations of near-term economic opportunities and costs over pretty much everything else. These frameworks are based on assumptions of predictability, continuity, and stability, and they're actually terrible at incorporating considerations of large, potentially existential risks and non-linear changes. And of course, they're also driving environmental destruction, climate instability, and entrenching inequality. So finally, again, it's important to emphasize that adaptation is not simply an alternative to mitigation through emissions reductions. The less we mitigate, the harder adaptation is going to be. It's often said that adaptation is a process, not an event. And it's clear that we're going to be adapting to the consequences of climate change for decades and probably centuries to come. These things take a long time to play out. But we need to take urgent action now to ensure that we have any prospect of adapting adequately in the longer term. And that's the challenge before us. So I'm going to hand over now to Joe, who is going to talk about societal vulnerability to climate change and look at examples from the past and the present. And then after that, we'll move on to the discussion and hopefully dig down into some of these thorny issues. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank Rupert very much for inviting me to come in and talk to you this evening, about transformational adaptation. Nick is right. What I'm going to do, I'm an archaeologist by training. I have some long-term experience in past climate change. And what I want to do is focus on societal vulnerability, really, looking at one past example and one example from the present day in Africa. You probably are asking at this point what transformational adaptation is and why we need to be concerned about it, really. So it is more, as Rupert said, than just increments of change. Everything that we have been doing up until now around the world, pretty much globally, has been what you would think of as incremental change. And that's because we're capable of doing that, because we have technologies, we have advancements, we innovate. We constantly innovate, we make things better, more efficient. And in doing things more efficiently, we constantly are able to increment. However, incremental adaptation is not going to last forever. At some point, we are going to have to transform the way in which we do things. And this comes with issues, with problems attached to it. If you're an archaeologist like me, the biggest question around transformational adaptation is, what does that mean for people's traditions, people's heritage? It is asking us as societies to change the way we do things dramatically. And in changing things dramatically, we are effectively threatening our traditions. So in the next 10 minutes, what I want to talk to you about is exactly this. What does transformational adaptation mean in a societal framework? What does it mean? What does it mean in the past? What can we see in the past in terms of how people have transformed? And what does it mean for present day scenarios? So I'm going to use two, and my screen has literally just disappeared as I started to talk to you. So I'm going to get it back. I'm going to use two examples. I'm going to talk about Greenland. Probably a lot of you will know about the demise of the Norse population of Greenland, who colonized Greenland around 900 BC and then disappear around 1450. The timing of that is partly with the Little Ice Age, and it's been written about by a lot of people, including Jared Diamond, who wrote a book in 2005 called Collapse: Why Societies Choose to Fail. And he talks about the the Norse population of Greenland, and how their demise might be related to climate change. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because there's new archaeological data on that, new archaeological evidence, which paints a more complicated picture and comes back to this issue of tradition and heritage. And then the second case I'm going to look at, the second example, case study, whatever you'd like to call it, is Ghana today, West Africa. Some people in the audience may know that Ghana, and to a lesser extent, but still problematic, Togo and Benin, are suffering terrible, terrible coastal erosion due to sea level rise, partly, but predominantly due to bad decision making and poor engineering design, which is leading to what I would say is now probably a pathway that they can't come back from in terms of what will happen to their coasts, to the coasts of Ghana in particular, over the next 10 years. And I want to look at that case study in relationship to transformational adaptation. You know, this is a case where there is no choice. It is transformational adaptation or nothing. So those are the two case studies I want to look at. So let's come back to Greenland. So Greenland was colonized in about 900 by supposedly by a Viking called Eric the Red, who was a bit murderous and murdered his way from Norway to Iceland, eventually ending up in Greenland, establishing a colony on the southern end of Greenland, which then over the next 500 years extended in size and number to something of the couple of thousands, somewhere between possibly 2,000 and 5,000 people at its height. It coincides, as some of you may know, with what is called the Little Ice Age, which is a period of cooling in the medieval period, beginning around the middle of the 13th century, 1257, with a volcanic eruption in Indonesia, which cools the Earth's surface due to a coverage of ash fallout, and has a long-term impact upon global climate, which impacts the world actually, but places like Greenland and the small colonies that exist in a fairly, really eking out an existence in what is already a fairly harsh environment, exacerbates the conditions that these people who had colonized a few hundred years earlier are living in. And Jared Diamond's interpretation of the outcome for the demise of the Norse population of Greenland is that climate change exacerbated what were poor decisions made on the part of the colonists, that the Norse colonists did not adapt to the conditions of living in a harsh Greenland environment, and they didn't learn from their Inuit neighbors who had colonized the north of Greenland sometime earlier, about 100 years later, actually. So the Norse were there prior to that. Partly this is true. Partly the Norse colonists did not adapt well to their environment, but it wasn't from lack of trying. And this is actually really important when we try to link it with with transformational adaptation. They actually tried to do everything right. So new archaeological evidence that is just being published in the last 2 years demonstrates from isotope analysis of teeth. So we know from teeth what they were eating, and they were eating seal. They were eating seal meat from the very beginning of their occupation from the first colonists on Greenland. They were hunting seal. So they may have come as farmers, which was the traditional lifestyle of Norway and Iceland, was to bring your sheep and your goat and your pigs. Pigs were pig meat. Pork was a desired meat amongst the Norse colonists. They came with their farming package, but they didn't try to continue a farming way of life. They almost immediately transformed themselves into seal hunters. And not only did they transform themselves into seal hunters, but they didn't hunt the easiest seals. So they didn't hunt harbour seals, which were very easy to catch. They hunted harp seals. We all know the very sad pictures of baby harp seals being killed, but they are more easy to, they are more difficult to hunt than harbour seals. So they learnt almost from the beginning that you need to sustain your subsistence base. You know, if you are going to move to a hunting strategy, you need to ensure that you do not cause an extinction of the animals that you are hunting, which we know from other past case studies happen fairly quickly. Almost every island that everyone colonized, New Zealand, almost all of the Pacific Islands, they hunt to extinction large mammals. This is not what happened on Greenland. So they change, they adapt, they transform, they do everything that you think is what is needed for transformational adaptation. But what they fail to do is diversify or actually reduce the risk. So what they are doing, what archaeologists have discovered, is that their principal reason for being in Greenland is not to colonize Greenland, but to exploit a resource, which is walrus ivory. Walrus ivory throughout the early medieval period is an extremely expensive elite material that is traded across Europe. And these Norsemen are in Greenland to exploit that resource. They're not there for any other reason. And by being there to exploit that resource, they create risk for themselves. So they're not, the only time that they can hunt walrus is in the summer, when they actually should be in their fields, tending their crops, looking after their animals. They're actually out 300 to 600 miles north hunting walrus. Eventually, what happens is that walrus ivory is not as desired as an elite material traded across Europe, and they basically lose their market to elephant ivory, which becomes important in the 13th and 14th century and is a better quality ivory. So for these colonists of Greenland, what happens to them is their failure to, two things happen. One is that they introduce risk and they fail to diversify. So even though they've tried to adapt, adaptation and transformational adaptation is much more than simply thinking that you can introduce a few different ways of different economic adaptations or different ways of thinking about how you're going to live. You have to not only transform what you do, but you have to mitigate the risks that you introduce at the point in which you do that. So they did not mitigate the risk. And that was ultimately their demise. If we move forward to Ghana in 2021, I'm just going to share my screen. I was going to show you a slide of sea level rise, which I will show you very quickly, actually, just to give you a sense of what we might be facing or what some parts of the world might be facing in the next century. It's not important to go into what representative concentration pathways, RCPs, are. What this graph shows is the blue line shows what we would expect in terms of sea level rise if we were to keep to below the Paris Agreement, if we were to keep to 1.5 degrees temperature rise. The red shows us what will happen if we go to something like 3 degrees rise in temperature. Actually, what will happen is we will fall somewhere in the middle in this white area. We're looking at probably 660 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, which will take us up to maybe about 2 or 2.5 degrees. So we're looking at a sea level rise of between 1 and 2 meters by 2300. What's really important in this graph is that we're actually going to look at close to 1 meter sea level, or above 0.5 meter sea level by 2100. Now, sea level rise doesn't work. It's not homogeneous. It depends on tide, and it depends on a whole range of geotectonic behaviors across the world. And some parts of the world are more affected than others. And indeed, one of the most affected regions of the world is the West African coast, which is a focus of some of the research I've been doing for the Ipcc in the last 18 months. And Ghana in particular is experiencing now real disaster from sea level rise and coastal erosion. And I just wanted to show you this image, which shows you one impact of sea level rise, which is terrible flooding of coastal villages, coastal towns. But the other, of course, is coastal erosion, both of which are caused almost by the same behavior. So you increase tide with storms, overtop any kind of sea barrier that you might have. And not only will you experience flooding and actually to some extent drowning under sand in some cases, but also the loss of your livelihood and the loss of your property. So Ghana is one of the worst impacted places on earth at the moment. And they've been trying to so some of the images that even today, literally in the news in Ghana, are the impacts of sea level rise. So it is uppermost in their mind what they are to do, how people whose livelihoods have for hundreds of years relied on the sea. So we're talking again, as I mentioned earlier, about tradition, about heritage. And I don't mean heritage in terms of castles or buildings. I'm talking about the way in which people live. And transformational adaptation asks us to change the way in which we live, asks us to change our traditions and our heritage. And that is actually going to be one of the barriers that we are going to face in the future in doing this. But Ghana is facing that literally today. What the Ghanaians are doing is, you would imagine, all of the right things. So a lot of the problems with coastal erosion and sea level rise in Ghana are to do with bad decisions that they have made, in historical decisions in the last 50 years, damming their major river system, which has reduced the outflow of sediment, which in turn has created subsidence and stopped the outflow of sediment to create beaches, ergo leading to erosion along the coast. To try to mitigate that, and Rupert mentioned mitigation, the Ghanaians have built barriers, hard barriers, engineered barriers, groins, these kinds of things to stop the erosion of sand. But these have just literally created bigger problems in other regions of the coast. So with all best intentions, all they have done is exacerbate an increasing problem that is leading to people losing their livelihoods. it's stopping people fish. So this area around the Volta River and further to the east is lagoon based, and the livelihood of these people for hundreds of years has been based on fishing in the lagoons, not in the open sea, in the lagoons, and they are losing these lagoons. So what do you do when you are losing your livelihood? Well, the Ipcc have a number of takeaways, a number of ideas for the Ghanaians, and in fact for the rest of the world that are suffering from exponential sea level rise. There are hard protection, which we've talked about, which doesn't work. Sediment-based or soft protection, which is ecosystem-based, and that does work, but it takes years to develop. So, if you want to think about I'm assuming a lot of people here are based in Norfolk. We have the same problems on the eastern coast of Norfolk. And, there are some views that say we will lose the Broads. Hard defences have been put in place along the beaches, but actually we should be looking at ecosystem-based protection if we are going to protect the Broads into the future. But as I said, we need the time to do that. There's also retreat, which means, basically leaving your livelihood, leaving where you live. There is also building out, which is what the Dutch have done. What in the Netherlands, you basically build out into the ocean as a method of protecting the future. All of these options are based on time. And what is clear to climate scientists, and particularly to do with extreme events, is that we don't have time. If the Earth had time to recover, like from the Australian bushfires, then we see recovery. But that's not happening anymore. There isn't time because the events happen one after the other. So now, if we are to protect our planet, we need to think about transformations, because we no longer have the time to think about other ways in which we can incrementally protect our planet. Okay, I'm going to leave it there because there's a lot more I can say, but we can say it in discussion, and I've gone over time anyway. So, yeah.
Jo, many thanks, and thanks also to Nick. I think we've provided folks with a good, rich vein of food for thought here. Let's have a bit of time among the three of us to chew that over before we throw it open. So I wanted to start off by responding to what you said there, Jo, near the end, which I'm very much in alignment with, where you were talking about what transformative adaptation might look like as opposed to disastrous incremental adaptation vis-a-vis flood protection, sea defenses, etc. I totally agree with you about ecosystem-based protection. That's clearly transformative adaptation potentially. So things like restoration of biodiverse wetlands or mangroves. Retreat may indeed be called for. One slightly more left field option that I want to throw in there, which has been used sometimes in some parts of the world, including a long time ago, quite successfully, is having more stuff floating rather than built down in the dry earth. Maybe that's going to be a wave of the future. But I wanted to query, Jo, your confidence about the sort of range that we're going to need to adapt to. Now, my own view, and I don't know where exactly the two of you sit on this question, my own view is that sea level rise is not the biggest threat we face from climate, that the vulnerabilities from weather degradation and around our food supply are probably greater, for example. But if we're talking about sea level rise, which obviously is an important consequence of the massive perturbation of the climate that we've begun, I was slightly surprised, Jo, that you were so confident that we're going to fall within those two ranges of where we would be according to the 1.5 projections and where we would be according to the 3-degree protections. My view is that we can be a lot less certain about where we're going to end up, and that indeed it is not impossible that we could end up outside the supposed worst case scenario projections, because that's happened a number of times over the past generation, that things that climate scientists have basically said, well, this is about as bad as it could get, that they've been exceeded vis-a-vis, for example, ice melt in some parts of the world. And it seems to me we could be in for some very rough surprises over the next century. For example, there are indications that the methane situation in the Arctic might be getting pretty hairy already. Yeah. So I'd just like to put to you: are you sure you want to stand by the confidence you exuded, Joe, on the question of what the range of sea level rise is going to be?
So yeah, okay. I see that Nick's got his hand up, and he's actually the expert on this. But I will just pipe up quickly. Yeah, you're right. I did some basic maths using some publications of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change in order to come up with what we would be looking at by 2100, and without any other drivers or factors coming into play, we are on a pathway to 660 parts per million carbon within the atmosphere, i.e. RCP 4.5. To people out there, that is representative concentration pathway. Nick told me not to bring this up. The Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change models scenarios, basically a scenario by which so if you had a scenario where you had this much carbon in the atmosphere, what would be the outcome? And it calls these scenarios representative concentration pathways, RCPs. We would like to be on the lower end of those. We are not going to be on the lower end of that modeling. We are going to be somewhere in the middle to the higher end. And that's what Rupert's talking about. And the thing is that what is out of our control are basically ecological factors that we can't model for because we don't know. So Rupert brought up melting of permafrost. This is really problematic because no one knows what melting, it's happening. We know it's happening, but no one knows what it's going to do. I read in a Nature paper this week that the conveyor belt may be turned off if influx. So when I say the conveyor belt, what we're talking about is the top end of the conveyor belt, which has a much more posh name, but the top end of that is the Gulf Stream, which comes past the west coast of Scotland. Now, if a lot of fresh water enters the North Atlantic, that fresh water, for reasons that I am not capable of explaining, that fresh water will turn off that system of the way in which salt water sinks and then rises again. And climate scientists don't know, and Nick might be able to put very quickly a little bit of finesse on this. Climate scientists don't know if this is going to happen, but they're terrified it is.
Yeah.
Because of the it's to do with it's always to do with the amount and the speed and quantity of change. So the fires that are happening in Australia and in California are not allowing for. It used to be that plants and animals would regenerate, species of worms and God knows what else, invertebrates would regenerate, but they happen so often that that's not happening anymore.
Yeah.
And so it's the speed, the frequency, and the amplitude that we haven't.
What's your take on this?
Yeah, so to deal with the sea level rise first. Yeah, in terms of where we're heading, I mean, sea levels take a long time to respond to climate forcing. It's worth noting, I think, the last time the world was about 3 degrees warmer than it has been historically, sea levels were some 20 to 30 meters higher. And even during the last interglacial, I think they were sort of 6 to 8 meters higher or thereabouts, possibly more. So I think even with sort of sub 3 degree levels of warming, then over the very long periods into the future, we can expect sea level rise in the many meters, perhaps tens of meters. So, I mean, it looks like we're sort of heading in that direction. So if I had to make a very, very long-term bet, then I'd bet that we would be seeing something approaching or exceeding 10 meters of sea level rise over the centuries. So, you know, most, I think, ballpark estimates are around about a meter, give or take, by 2100. But I think it could be more than that. There have been a lot of estimates, and they change over time. The earlier Ipcc estimates were quite conservative, but that was because they simply didn't have the capacity to model, to incorporate the potential impacts of ice sheet collapses in Antarctica, for example. And they were revised upwards because the ability to model those improved. But there are still uncertainties there. And I think essentially, if you look at Ipcc projections, then if you can't model something and you can't incorporate it, it gets left out. So those estimates are probably conservative. That is improving. But we know from the past, you know, sort of geological evidence that rates of sea level rise of 1.6 meters per century are entirely physically plausible during deglaciations. Obviously, we're not really in a deglaciation phase. But so I'd say that, you know, post 2100, we might see sort of a meter or more by then. But we can expect 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise per century after that, for possibly a millennium or more. So I think this again goes back to the issue of adaptation being a continuous process now. We've locked in changes that will affect our future generations for centuries or millennia. In terms of the North Atlantic conveyor slowing down, Joe was talking about the slowing down essentially of the North Atlantic circulation, that conveyor belt that brings the warm tropical waters up to the north, and then where they cool and you get you know, cold salty water sinking, and that drives the entire ocean circulation. Yeah, a while back people were very concerned about this, and then the concern sort of died down. But very recently, with the paper that Joe mentioned, there's concern again, and some climate scientists are out on Twitter saying, we are really worried about this. This is potentially terrifying. So it appears that risk of a slowdown or shutdown of the North Atlantic conveyor is back on the agenda, back on the radar, as something that some people are very, very concerned about. And certainly there are an awful lot of unknowns in the climate system that are very difficult to model, that often aren't incorporated into the models just because we don't have the ability to model them. As I said, that's improving over time, but there are still sort of surprises lurking there. So yeah, there is plenty of potential for surprise. Joe's right that if we look at the RCP6 scenario, which is sort of seems to be more or less what we're mapping, perhaps a bit above that, then that takes us to about 2.5 degrees of warming. And the most recent modelling estimates, the central range is under 3 degrees for the end of the century. But again, we can't bank on that at the moment.
No. Yeah, we're getting some absolutely fabulous questions coming through. I want us to start to address these among the three of us here. So I'm going to start off with Elaine's question, which is quite straightforward, but also quite big. How are we going to make these changes and start to transform society and move beyond capitalism?
Wow.
Okay, so I'm gonna chuck a possibly unpopular view in here and see how Nick and Joe respond to it. My view is that if by we mean whole societies or countries or civilizations, then basically we're not. At least we're not for quite a long time yet. And that's part of my motivation for the remarks I made towards the end of my little spiel, where part of what I was trying to imply was, I think we have to start to take some of this into our own hands. So transformative adaptation has been mostly talked about insofar as it has been talked about so far, as I said, among academics and to some extent among policymakers and among some people on the ground who are trying to do projects here and there. but it hasn't entered public discourse in any significant way, and it hasn't influenced climate activism, for example, in any significant way. And part of what I was trying to say was, I think that has to change. And I think that we are almost certainly not going to see our societies or our civilization responding adequately for quite a while to come yet. That if the transformation gets forced upon us, as I say, as Nick said, it will be ugly, and I envisage that being at least part of what happens. So part of my perspective here is that we need to start getting this into mainstream discourses, including the discourses of the climate movement and the green movement and so on. And we need to have more people, including activists and community organizers and so on, trying to start to do transformative adaptation. Because if we wait for our governments to do it, we're going to be waiting until it's too late. Joe, Nick, what do you make of that perspective?
Well, I'll be quick because I wasn't. I completely agree. The thing about transformation, the issue with it's not an issue, it's important, but transformational adaptation requires us to probably give up our traditions and some of our ways of life. And I think people are going to find that quite difficult. And so therefore it cannot be a top-down application of, imposition of this is what you should be doing. It's got to be small steps, I think. I think people at the society level, at the small community level, need to say, let's get together and make a decision that we're not going to do this or we're not going to do that. Because asking people we're talking about history, people's history is incredibly important to them. And transformational adaptation requires people to jettison some of that, I think.
Yeah.
Nick?
Yeah, so I think, again, taking a sort of step back, there's quite a lot of terms sort of floating around here. So we hear a lot about transformational change, certainly in the area that I work in, which is dealing a lot with governments, policymakers, international organizations, NGOs, that people love to talk about transformational change. And it's a very sort of positive, lovely, sort of fluffy, aspirational sort of thing. We want transformational change. And this is always seen as a sort of pretty much by definition a good thing. What they're generally talking about is improving governance and institutions to make everything sort of fairer and more just and deliver more support to the poorest and most vulnerable, which is all very worthy. If we look at how the Ipcc defines transformational adaptation and how I've historically tended to view transformational adaptation, particularly with that sort of archaeological lens, transformational adaptation I've always thought of as something that happens on the ground when you can't do what you've been doing. So you have to basically abandon, the systems and practices that you've been depending on for, possibly indefinitely, and realize that you have to do something else. So you abandon existing systems and practices, you replace them with something else, or you really, really radically sort of transform them. And as we see, looking at, evidence from the past, this isn't always a comfortable process, and often it's something that people are forced into. So transformational adaptation might be in response to a transformational change in the environment that means your current system and practices just aren't viable anymore. You have to do something. Now, where this sort of links with the idea of wider transformative adaptation and change is that if we're going to make these, big changes on the ground, then yes, this has to be owned by the people doing the adaptation, but people act within contexts that are framed and influenced by policies, by regulations, by all sorts of other factors, other drivers, some of which drive vulnerability quite heavily. So we also need transformational changes into governance, institutions, in mindsets, in thinking, decision-making frameworks at all levels to enable that transformational adaptation on the ground where it's needed. So to me, I quite like this framing where you have transformative adaptation consists of transformational adaptation on the ground to the hard physical stuff, supported by transformational changes in the sort of environments, the institutional environments, and so on, that frame and either enable or inhibit people to act on the ground. But I think, and again, sorry, carry on.
Well, yeah, just to interrupt at that point, Nick, because it's really interesting. I guess what part of what I was trying to imply was, how are we going to get those genuinely good transformational changes at the level of government and policy making and so on? I was expressing skepticism that we're going to get them through a sort of rational process of some academics producing some papers and some politicians and leaders deciding to be very sensible and far-sighted. And trying to suggest that if we're going to get them at all, which I'm uncertain of, but if we're going to get them at all, then we're going to get them probably by them being taken up by civil society, and by them being modelled on the ground by people who just start trying to do them. And in that sense, I was suggesting that, as I see it, it's imperative that the field, the concepts, the potentialities, the reality of transformative adaptation starts to be created by real people, as it were, by citizens, by activists, by farmers, by communities on the ground, and that sort of bottom-up and collaborative process is our best hope at starting to create a situation where what happens at government and policy making and international level, etc., on this stuff starts to become remotely adequate.
No, I agree with that, and I think, and again, you can't. It's sort of goes back to the old false dichotomy between sort of individual versus systemic action. The two are linked. Unless we sort of completely get rid of governments and those sort of governing frameworks and sort of live in an anarchist utopia, which sounds quite appealing sometimes, but I don't know how realistic that is. We're going to have to contend with the fact that those structures in some form are there. But I think what we need to look at is how, and I think you're absolutely right, we need to get these ideas into sort of the mainstream, into activists, into the population at large, because the way governments act is framed by perceived social norms, what's acceptable, what they can get away with. If there's a public appetite for certain changes, then they're more likely to be made at the policy level. So and that's not the only one that happens. People can take things into their own hands, certainly at the local level. And most adaptation, not all of it, but I say most of it, is probably people doing stuff on the ground in response to changes that they're experiencing and in response to their evolving needs. But in terms of behavioural change, then I think changing people's appetite, but changing the norms and values around what's seen as acceptable, the social license for certain activities, to make things more or less likely at the policy level, depending on what people want, what they demand. We demand that you do this. There's a public appetite for this type of action. There's a public appetite for you to stop doing that. And so this also goes back to, changing these decision-making frameworks. They're completely dominated now by, certain economic framings that I mentioned with, privileging short-term economic opportunities and costs over pretty much everything else. So we have to exert pressure to change that somehow. We can't just sort of try and advise governments to sort of, well, that's not very sensible, is it? We need to do something different. I remember just a very brief anecdote. About 20 years ago, I was in a meeting with somebody from the Treasury, Number 10 and DEFRA, and we were talking about the 2-degree target and how you needed to limit greenhouse concentrations at around about 450 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the guy from Treasury, we can probably do 550, but 450 is a bit much. So he was sort of negotiating with the climate system through me as an intermediary. And that type of rigidity in thinking in the face of, well, we know if we do this, the world will explode, but actually this is what the economic framing tells us, so we'll do it anyway. We need to change that. And so we need somehow to get society to demand those changes.
Yes.
And so there's a link there across those scales. I'll shut up now because I'm rambling.
And I'm very much hoping that some of this will happen in the radical climate movement soon. I've now moved on from Extinction Rebellion, but while I was in Extinction Rebellion, I was a little frustrated that Extinction Rebellion didn't pick up the call for transformative and deep adaptation in a significant way. Joe, what's your take on what we've just been saying?
Well, only that. So my take is, I completely agree with you, Nick. This kind of trade-off, this horse trading in in, carbon emissions is just appalling, really, and governments should be called to account for that. What worries me is that with all the best intentions, people, governments, other organizations, who might think they're making the right decisions, make the wrong decisions. And we can see that historically. And that's really what concerns me, is that not simply that we're dealing with having to talk to these people who are horse trading in carbon, but equally those people who have the right frame of mind and the best intentions, but still make the wrong decisions. That I don't know. That, we're coming back to Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, aren't we, at that point? There are so many things that we just simply don't know whether we're going to make the right decision.
Yeah. So we've got some very powerful questions, as I say, emerging in the chat. So I'm going to ask a couple of our questioners to put their emotionally powerful messages to us in person now. So can I invite Ruth Taylor and Georgia Lown to unmute yourselves and put your videos on one after another and tell us how you're responding to what we're saying here this evening. So first, Ruth.
Thank you, Rupert. It was just to say I put the chat in the question in the chat that I work for Norfolk and Waveney Mind, and we've heard lots from people bringing eco-anxiety to our organisation, and I just feel as a society, we're in paralysis and avoidant about what's coming. We're trying to do stuff around Joanna Macy's work around active hope and how we can feel hopeless, but we can still act from that. And I just wondered if the panel had any comments about what they felt would be useful as society to help us to unhook from that kind of the panic and the addiction, I guess, to our current level of lifestyle.
Brilliant, thank you. And Georgia?
Oh, hi. Yeah, so mine was so I've just done a master's in psychology and education. So that was a year long, all about kids, adolescents. Climate has been raised, I think, once. And I mentioned for my dissertation, I wanted to do, because we often talk about the mental health crisis. And I suggested to my supervisor that I wanted to do adolescents, anxiety, depression, and climate. And he runs an entire module on adolescent mental health. And he said, oh, that's an interesting idea. I'd not thought of that. So I suppose my question is how, I know even for me to come to this event is like, I'm like, oh, shall I, or will I just be sad for 2 weeks? Shall I just avoid it? And I'm actively interested and want to know. So I suppose my question is just how do you think it's possible to get it into everyday conversation with just, because obviously it needs to be the majority of people who are aware of these issues and talking about them. And I suppose I don't really expect you to have an answer. It's just how can we go about doing that? So, because if I talk to my friends about it, they just get scared and they don't want to talk about it. So it's like, how do we get over that? It's a very similar question to Ruth's, I suppose.
Yeah. So that's why I put you together. I think it's really, really important. Let me make a little start and then see if my colleagues here have got any wisdom to add. My kind of guess from what the two of you have said is that you've both been suffering from some eco-anxiety or climate anxiety yourselves, and that you feel a bit isolated in that. I think the first thing to notice is that you're not as isolated as you might think, because there's two of you and then there's me as well, and there's probably quite a lot of other people on this call here this evening, and actually there's all the other people that you're mentioning as well, right? It's just that what many of them are trying to do is not face it. And part of my take on this is actually sooner or later people are going to have to face it. So it may as well be sooner, because if you face it sooner, then A, it's more likely you'll actually do something about it, which would be great. But B, also, it's less likely you'll be sideswiped by it. So when I'm thinking about the fact that I've suffered quite badly sometimes, including last summer and autumn from climate anxiety, and if I feel inclined to kind of feel sorry for myself about it, I remind myself that actually those of us who are feeling it now and are letting ourselves feel it, that we are the lucky ones, because as climate decline worsens, which is bound to happen for at least as long as we carry on not reaching net zero, more and more people are going to be hit by it, and they're going to be people who are not psychologically prepared, who haven't felt it before and have been trying to suppress it. The people you've been talking about who say, "Oh, well, I don't really want to think about that. You know, that can we talk about something else?" So actually, although it feels painful to experience it, it's better than the alternative. It's better than not experiencing it. I think that's a positive place to start. And I come at this partly from the perspective of having been a student of Joanna Macy's and having understood through working with her the way that actually sometimes it's really better to feel even desperately difficult emotions like despair than not feel them. The trick is not to get stuck in them permanently. And the way to not get stuck in them permanently is to feel them and address them and do something about it. My other tip is relevant works of art, and I teach relevant films like Never Let Me Go, The Road, Avatar, Gravity, Melancholia. I've just taught Melancholia, which is just an absolutely magnificent meditation on the things that you've both been asking about. You know, it's about depression and anxiety, and it's about the possible end of the world. And I find that looking hard at that and looking at it with students and sort of taking them through it is a very effective way of enabling ourselves to become more literate in this area and enabling ourselves to face up to these difficult questions that you've brought up. So I hope that's of some use. Nick or Joe, have you got anything to throw into the equation?
Sure, I'll jump in. So, you know, not long ago, I did a review for a client actually looking at, you know, the literature around how you might sort of help to encourage a shift, a transformational shift in this context, sort of towards, you know, acceptance and movement towards the net zero agenda. And talk about that, whatever. But so it was really fascinating to look at a lot of the literature around sort of the psychology and sort of agency. And one thing that sort of really jumped out, which is probably not rocket science or even a revelation to anybody here, but I think it's just worth emphasizing, is that obviously narratives of despair on their own don't really, you know, stimulate much inspiration or action. But what really seems to work in terms of motivating people is a perception of that, in this case, climate change does present a risk to something or some, you know, some values that are important to them, but coupled with the, you know, belief that they have agency to do something about it. So the question here is, you know, we've got the awareness, and I think people shy away with this because they think, well, what on earth can I do about it? The question is, how do we give people agency to act on it, you know, in whatever capacity? And some people have advocated getting more involved in activism because it gives you a sense of agency and might actually do some good. So sort of activism as therapy for climate and eco-anxiety is certainly something that's been proposed and seems to work. And in terms of you know, working with children, I mean, I looked at this to a certain extent. I have a child myself, so I'm sort of a little bit familiar with this. I go and talk to her primary school about you know, climate change and sort of we touched on ideas of eco-anxiety. But I think one thing to recognise, and it's important to emphasise, this isn't all children, but children are actually playing a really, really important part and exercising a lot of agency in the climate space at the moment with the school strike, for example. And they're providing some really brilliant leadership. And I think the school strike probably, along with Extinction Rebellion, played a big role in shifting the narrative towards, you know, at least on paper, or at least in rhetoric, moves towards net zero and addressing climate change and taking it seriously. Obviously, in the UK, the fact that we're holding the COP climate conference this year, was meant to be last year, probably helped too. But I think that was really important. And I keep sort of coming back to this one paper that I read that demonstrated that one of the most effective avenues for changing the minds of adults was children, and in particularly daughters influencing very, very conservative fathers to change their views and perceptions, because they depoliticize climate change. They're seen as sort of trusted actors, not some outsider who's coming in with a political or ideological axe to grind. So I think, how do we sort of empower children, give them agency, and actually allow them to lead? Now, it's not saying all children are going to be leaders, and we certainly shouldn't expect kids to dig us out of the hole that we've dug for them. But recognizing that there is agency there is leadership, and supporting them and being allies, and rather than thinking it's all necessarily coming from us, and letting them lead the conversation. These seems to be the takeaways. I don't know if that's any help, or whether there's any insight there at all that you don't already have. But this coupling of risk with agency, perceptions of risk with the perception that you have the capacity to do something about it, and the big question is, how do we develop that agency? I think that's really critical.
Just quickly before Joe perhaps comes in, just on that last point about daughters and conservative fathers, Nick, that was totally the experience that I had in Davos at the World Economic Forum when I got invited there last year in 2020. That I can't tell you how many times in Davos I heard CEOs and politicians and so on saying things like, well, I've been forced to face up to the climate issue, because otherwise every Friday at the breakfast table, my daughter gives me grief and says, I'm about to go off to the school strike and your company's destroying the world, Dad. How does that add up? It happened over and over again, which was quite an interesting phenomenon. Joe, anything to add?
Well, only that surprises me, because, I was listening to Nick and thinking that sounded really nice. And I don't mean the use of the word nice in the best sense, Nick, because I just simply don't agree with you. I don't. I think money and big companies come before 9-year-old daughters at the breakfast table telling their CEO father, when they go into the boardroom today, they really must think about their daughter and not their shareholders. I'm sorry, I just don't get that. So I'm not as positive as either of you, really, in that regard. I think that the big companies need to be brought to account. And I don't think 9-year-old daughters are going to do that, as much as I admit that come the next generation, they will have agency. Absolutely. But right now, when it matters, you have 55-year-old men as CEOs of all of the biggest companies that are the biggest polluters in the world. And their daughters are not helping at the moment.
It's certainly not the only avenue to pursue. I think the other thing we can say here, to speak directly to that point, is we need to change the conversation. We need to change the perception of these people that you're talking about, the people who are running these highly extractive, fossil-intensive companies, change their perceptions of risk. So I think just get more people talking about climate reparations, talking about litigation, talking about, I think we really should have a Nuremberg-style process to try the, people who deliberately misled people about climate change and deliberately delayed action, because there will be a lot of deaths on their hands. So just get that in the air, so people start thinking, well, hello, we've got the potential in the future for litigation, for reparations, for punitive damages, and possibly even personal responsibility. And again, it's a question of what can we do to sort of tear down these systems that are driving the problem. So we've got to look at anything we can do, and there are examples in the literature again of where energy companies have sort of changed their policies because they realize the conversation is shifting. So you have fossil fuel companies who have previously opposed carbon prices proposing this as a solution, because they know that, well, at least it's a solution that will allow us to keep operating. So it's cynical. but it's better than the alternative, which is possibly, sort of punitive damages against them. So that, you can shift that behavior. What we ultimately want to do is, while it'd be gratifying to, tear down the fossil fuel infrastructure and put a lot of people in prison, ultimately what we want to refocus all that energy towards, literally, towards things that are helpful rather than hindrance. So we're not going to get ourselves at this hole just by electrifying everything and carrying with business as usual, but renewables. But that is one part of the solution. So we need all that expertise and all those resources that are currently devoted to fossil fuel extraction to be devoted to the development of renewables and greener infrastructure, because we do need that as part of the solution. So that's where we want to go. Shift the conversation, shift the risk perceptions, so the perception of risk exceeds people's appetite for risk to encourage that transition there. Easy to say, more difficult to do, but just being more vocal about these things and making it normal for people to discuss things that are currently sort of anathema to the fossil fuel industry and to governments as well. And I think slowly we might get there. Obviously, we need to do it quickly, but I'm not sure what else to suggest. There's no magic bullet. Just
to add to that, Joe, that I was not making some kind of naive declaration that this what I observed at Davos was going to make everything fine. And I think that I'm quite a rad activist on the side myself, and I'm not averse to getting arrested protesting directly against these very people. But all I was trying to indicate was that it's to say the least interesting and impressive that young people have managed to enter into the discourse here at all. But I totally agree with you, Joe, when you say, and Nick, I think, was saying the same thing earlier, that it's completely wrong for us to put the responsibility for fixing this onto very young people. We as adults have to take responsibility, and the generation that has the power now is the generation that has by far the most responsibility for what happens now, and we've got to step up to that.
And I'm not saying that young people don't have agency and don't have a really strong voice. My daughter's 19 and she wants to be incredibly active in this area, but she's not there yet.
Yeah.
What we need to do is harness what is there now. We need to change the views of the people who are CEOs of the polluting companies somehow. I don't know how, but
yeah. And what I was saying before was, I'm not sure we'll succeed, so we need to have plan Bs as well.
I think also just to jump there, the question was also about addressing, children's mental health and mental well-being.
Yes.
So it's not just about, it's not about using kids to overthrow the evil, powers that are driving this problem. It's actually about how do you support children and maybe helping to, empower them and support their agency and be allies to them. It is good for them, whether or not it will actually overthrow, Mordor or whatever. So
yeah.
But I think they know, and that's what's really great, is that they know. And I think that the issue is that we didn't know. So, I look back to my past, and I'm the same age as these CEOs who run these big polluting companies. Okay, so I'm going to admit to that. I'm just about to turn 58. So I am that age group. I grew up in the 70s when none of this was an issue, and I had aspirations probably to be the CEO of Shell. I wasn't. I promise that wasn't my aspiration. But that wouldn't have been something that anyone would have frowned upon when I was growing up in the 70s. But now that would be something frowned upon. Our children, my daughter who's 19, is in a different place. And a place to change this, which is great.
That's a positive societal change, right?
Yeah.
The fact that people don't just kind of think it's unproblematic anymore to aspire to be the high up in a fossil fuel.
Yeah, in a fossil fuel company.
Yeah.
You wouldn't join one ever now. You wouldn't if you had any sense of morality, you would not apply for a job in a fossil fuel company.
Unless maybe you were going to plan on being a whistleblower or a double agent or something.
Yeah,
that could be a very smart career choice for anyone wanting a kind of left field career choice on this call.
When I was growing up, that was fine. And then I would have been a company man. You know,
Yes.
You join at 20, you're a company man. By the time you're 40, you're not going to be a whistleblower, are you? So it's not our generation. It's my daughter's generation. It's Nick's daughter's generation. It's your generation, you know, the younger people, not us.
So let's come back to Georgina and Ruth. So traditionally, when people do this kind of coming back, basically what they want is for the audience member to say, yes, I'm feeling better now. But I'm not going to put that on you, because it seems to me that that is part of the actual problem that we have, right? That everyone's desperately trying to make everyone else feel okay about this. And part of what I was trying to say, and what the Climate Psychology Alliance, I think, are trying to teach, is the thought that, no, actually, we have to experience some of these painful emotions. If we don't, we're not being authentic, we're in denial, we're not going to come into our full power, and we're just putting off the problem and making it worse further down the track, both the literal material problem and the psychological problem. So I'm simply going to come back to you and say, what do you think? Have we been at all helpful there? And do you have further reflections, either of you?
I would say, although it sounds kind of horribly ignorant, but I actually feel much more positive after coming to this event than I have for a while, because I often just, I'm very interested in the emotions around it, but I go in and out of reading things about the science and then completely ignoring it because I don't want to know. So actually I've had sometimes I sort of think like, oh, okay, maybe the world will be entirely on fire in the next 15 years. And I just have, because I don't know enough about the science. So actually hearing, oh, there is a plan B. We're not just destined to absolutely fail. It's actually more optimistic, and probably understanding more of the science is actually more helpful than, I think we're, I suppose this is obvious, but you can make things even worse than probably the reality through being ignorant or knowing a little bit, but not enough. So no, I actually feel much better. So thank you for this event. Great.
And Ruth?
I feel much better having just had an opportunity to hear from you all, and to hear from Georgia, and I'm sure there's others as well in the audience who are all doing amazing community stuff. That it's just great to me as sort of, I guess, a bit of a representative of a community organisation, that we're all trying to tackle this and bringing it to light in the ways that we can. So yeah, I just would encourage people to go towards that Climate Psychology Alliance site, and as an organisation, I'm really hoping that we're going to be doing more to help us all come to terms with this emotionally. So yeah, thanks so much for giving the question so much.
Great. Nick, briefly, and then we'll move on to our next question.
Yeah, I was just going to second George's comment about sort of understanding the science a bit better, because I mean, don't get me wrong, the science is in many respects terrifying, and it certainly tells us that everything isn't going to be all right, but it also tells us this isn't the end of the world. You know, when you do understand a problem, even if it's sort of terrifying, I think you do feel a bit more agency over it. And so I think better understanding of the science and of what the issues are shows that, yeah, we are in some, dire trouble, but it's not, maybe as universally systemically catastrophic as some people would have you believe. That's not to say it's not catastrophic, but I think, again, we have to recognize that the impacts and the consequences are going to be geographically differentiated, also, of course, socially differentiated. So, by understanding that, you can say, well, where are the biggest problems? Where do we need to try and target solutions? And what is it that we need to do, rather than just thinking there's this massive, scary thing coming at me and I don't understand it well enough, but I know it's really bad, and I just, don't know how to respond. So understanding, even if that does, mean expose yourself to some of the scary facts, I think has got to help. So maybe more, networks, communities of practice, or fora where people can talk about things and develop a better public understanding of the issue, like this, might be helpful. I don't know.
No, that's a good idea.
Yeah. Let's take a couple of really interesting questions from the chat. So I'm just going to read a couple out. So here, Hannah asks way back, how do we as scientists, I take it that Hannah is a scientist, go about communicating these very stark messages to people who are not well versed in science or understanding, and yet give them the hope that transformative adaptation will give us our best chance for survival, which is a question very dear to my heart. And then we've got a couple of variations on the theme from Peter Belton. And Pete says, how would you describe the transformation in thinking and worldview that is necessary? And then more recently, he says, have any of the panel developed alternative visions of the way life could and should be when it has been adaptively transformed?
That's interesting.
Yeah. Do we have anything to say to those questions, colleagues?
So my experience from being an archaeologist is that rigidity in systems is a vulnerability, is destined to fail, that we need to, and Rupert, we were talking about this the other night, actually, about the fact that Britain, the UK is vulnerable on a whole range of levels to, to climate change, but to all sorts of situations that might be faced in the future, because it has not enabled itself to have a diverse base. So it's not a manufacturing country. It's not, basically it is a service provider. And if you can't provide those services anymore for a variety of reasons, then you are vulnerable. Yeah. And I mean, both of you can pick up on this, obviously, but to me, it is inflexibility in systems and vulnerability in systems that are going to be crucial into the future.
Yes. So this connects with what I was gesturing at earlier when I said that if I had to isolate my biggest concern of all around the climate decline that's coming and the need for transformative adaptation, etc., it would be around food vulnerability, which of course in turn is largely a factor of water availability and of weather stability. And exactly as you say, Joe, we had a very interesting discussion earlier in this lecture series, actually, in the first lecture with Amitav Ghosh. And Amitav, who of course is from India, made this point in a very fascinating way. He said, look at the coronavirus pandemic. Who would have thought 18 months ago that 2 of the 3 worst affected countries in the whole world would be the USA and the UK, and that countries like Sierra Leone and New Zealand and Vietnam and South Korea and Taiwan, and even a country like India to some extent, would be comparatively doing okay. And he suggested that the kind of complacency that a lot of people in countries like the UK have in relation to climate, including activists who say, oh, well, we need to be concentrating on solidarity with low-lying island states and with Bangladesh and with Nigeria and so forth. The complacency that such people have about our own situation here in the UK is not merited. And we should be open to the very real potentiality of ourselves in a country like this, a country that feels incredibly rich and safe and secure and invulnerable. We should be ready for the possibility that we are going to be vulnerable, just as we have proven to be vulnerable over coronavirus to a large extent because of our unwillingness to break with precedent by preventing travel, for example, our unwillingness to act according to the precautionary principle, our unwillingness to prioritize human life over short-term economics. You know, are we confident that we're going to do better in the climate shocks and ecological shocks that are coming? I mean, hopefully we're going to learn from the coronavirus and from the horrific job we've made of it in this country. But I'm not certain we are. I mean, on this first anniversary of lockdown, it seems to me that most of the media are sort of still being incredibly kind to our government. Whereas, as I see it, the government should be completely out on their ears, like the appeasers were in 1940, just no longer taken seriously. I mean, these people have utterly failed. All their careers should be over. And yet, no, they're still there and they're going to carry on. So they'll be the ones who are in charge if we get some kind of serious, whatever, you know, climate hit, food crisis, perhaps 2 or 3 years time, or it could be 20 or 30 years time, but it could be 2 or 3 years time. We are moving into terra incognita climate-wise. And I one of the main things that I try to do with my little public profile is to get people in countries like this to understand we are not invulnerable. This is not just about what happens to people in so-called developing countries. This is something which could affect us very badly too, and could puncture our over complex systems and our very long supply lines and our inability to feed ourselves and so on very, very badly. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why I feel passionately about transformative adaptation, because I want us to do it here, because I fear that if we don't, we could get very, very rudely surprised within my lifetime. Now, we haven't really succeeded in answering Peter's questions yet. So, Nick, can you offer anything beyond what we've said so far?
I'm trying to think back to the nature of the question. So there was.
So Peter's asking, have we got visions of what life will be like when it's adaptively transformed? What's the transformation of thinking that and worldview that is necessary?
So that's a really, really massive question. And so, you know, and again, there's a lot of work around sort of worldviews, how these sort of inform people's norms, values, behavior, how they're related to ideologies that are deliberately promoted and so on. And I think, you know, we have a particular sort of set of problems that are associated with dominant sort of political and economic ideologies at the moment, that are very sort of materialistic, very instrumentalist. They sort of externalize environmental costs. They view human beings as sitting sort of outside and separate from and above the wider environment. They're based on, you know, principles of ownership and dominance and so on. And we sort of think that this is just normal and natural, and this is sort of how people view the world and how they've always behaved. But you know, these sort of traditions, if you want to call them that, these ideological traditions, do come from very sort of particular places, and they're not universal. And I think we start recognizing that the way we're sort of approaching things now comes from a very, very sort of specific, actually Western European sort of historical tradition, and that there are alternative ways of looking at the world. We don't need to be trapped in this. You know, there is an alternative. There are many alternatives. And if we think about the way people have interacted with the environment over the 200,000 odd years that we've been Homo sapiens sapiens, what we've seen in, you know, sort of and again, I have this sort of great interest in sort of how climate change is, you know, related to the emergence of civilizations and how we've sort of taken ideas of progress from our sort of misunderstanding of these processes. So I think we're sort of locked into the set of assumptions that we just take as axiomatic. But actually, the way we're doing things is actually anomalous. The way we operate as sort of these sort of, essentially, if you want to call them capitalistic civilizations, or even as civilizations where that are based on sort of strongly hierarchical systems, that are based on the domination of the natural world and the domination of people. This is an anomaly. It's sort of like a 5,000-year experiment in a 200,000-year history, the outcome of which is still uncertain. And to a certain extent, you know, from my reading, this has been triggered by the adaptations that people made when they started developing these very complex societies in the face of past, you know, massive changes in climate. So let's try and sort of relocate ourselves and say, well, you know, this is the way we've been doing stuff for quite some time now, particularly in the West, but it's not the only way of thinking. It's actually anomalous in the grand scheme of sort of human history and human culture. So what are the alternatives? And we have models, we have other cultural models as well that we can follow.
Nice.
I think just very briefly also in terms of, there was a question I think about communicating sort of the science that populations that aren't sort of really au fait with the science and might find it sort of challenging. And I think I'd say that one of our biggest failures when it comes to climate change, obviously there are many failures, but one aspect of our not tackling climate change is a failure of the imagination. And I think it goes back to what you said at the beginning, Rupert, that we find it really difficult to even imagine that the world can be a radically different place. And so if people can sort of envisage what the world might physically look like in the future and what this would mean for society, or actually physically what it looked like in the past, then that might be an entry point, an opening for people to think, oh, how would we live in that sort of physical world? And I just sort of dug it out. There's a picture that I sometimes show. I don't know, is my backdrop changed now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I'll just move out of the way. So this is a pillar of lake sediment from the central Sahara. And this shows that this part of North Africa, which is now one of the driest places on Earth, used to be underwater. Now, this almost certainly dates from the last interglacial. So it just shows us the magnitude of change in the landscape you can have with big changes in climate. And we're looking at changes in temperature of a comparable magnitude to the changes in temperature, between the Ice Age and the interglacial. So we're going to see changes like this. Areas that are currently wet are going to become arid, areas that are arid might become wet, and so on. The world will be a really, really different place. And by looking at, sort of visuals of the past and of the potential future, and I know Tyndall Centre colleagues of mine did a lot of work around sort of, envisaging climate futures. That might be the entry point to get people thinking a bit more sort of lucidly and loosely around what the possibilities are.
And can I come in just really briefly as an archaeologist of islands, which has been a focus of mine for many, many years. Britain has an opportunity now to do something different. We are in a globalized world, so the restraints upon what that doing different might be are constrained by globalization. But if you want to look at anything positive about Brexit, and I'm not saying that Brexit was a positive thing. What I'm saying is that when you have an opportunity as an island to do something different from other places in the world where you're completely tied to a continent, now might be the time that Britain actually has an opportunity to do something different to what it's been doing. So, yeah.
I actually agree with that. I think that we have to, now that we have left the EU, we have to look for alternative ways of doing things. And the alternative way of doing things, I think, would be a transformative adaptation way, would be to say, well, what if we were to seek to radically relocalize? What if, rather than rushing to be so-called global Britain, which is just kind of trying to put the old kind of globalization paradigm on steroids, what if we were to move in the opposite direction and actually take seriously trying to become food secure, food sovereign, trying to reduce those supply lines, not eliminate them, of course not, but reduce them and reduce the kind of hyper dependency we have
but also
on the rest of the world.
Them.
What's that?
Reliant, diversify them so that you are not reliant. And
well, of course
that's what we've learned from the past.
So we're massively reliant on just a tiny number of crops, and that's a very risky strategy. Can I throw in terms of what Pete Belton was asking, a couple of further thoughts. One is, so Nick's offered this lovely historical example. I'm going to do something a bit easier and cheaper, which is to offer a fictional example. I think that Ursula Le Guin's novel, The Dispossessed, is a great model here. Possibly her greatest political novel, where she's trying to describe the survival of a society which is trying to be to build a better future, to be utopian, under enormous climatic pressure. And the really brilliant idea she comes up with is that the thought is, is that there is no such thing as having transformatively adapted. It's, as Nick was, I think, implying earlier, rather it's a kind of continual process. And you have to try to be all the time making what you're doing new and alive and responsive to the environment and the context that you're in, and so on. It's not a question of arriving somewhere new. It's a question of trying to be adaptively in process and responsive to what's happening. So that's Le Guin's novel, The Dispossessed. The quite bold thing that I would try to say in response to Pete's question when he asks, look, what is the transformation in thinking and worldview that is necessary? I would say it's that we have to give up the idea that we can carry on with our current system. And that's what I mean with this little book that I published last year that made quite a big impact. This Civilization is Finished. The meaning of that title is not that we're bound to collapse. The meaning of that title is that the only way we get to not collapse now is by voluntarily and intelligently, farsightedly transforming ahead of potential collapse. So we have to change our system radically. And what is that change to? I think it's a system which, as I was implying before, is a lot closer to the land, a lot more local, a lot more diverse, and trying to draw on the wisdom of peasant societies and indigenous cultures, and not trying to constantly progress to the next thing, because that idea of constant societal and economic progress is actually the very thing that, as I think Nick may have been implying, has got us into the disastrous situation that we're now in.
Also based on a total misreading of human history. So.
Yeah. I really like what you're saying about that, Nick. I think that deserves to be wider known. Okay, we are coming towards the end here. We've got time for one or two more questions. So let's take this fascinating little question from Greg Dance. Do the panel think it might help people in the general populace to understand adaptation if they tried being a refugee for 6 months? Now, I'm not sure how literally Greg intends the question, but I think we get the general sort of idea of it. Joe or Nick, do you have a take on this? Is this another kind of imaginal way, and maybe there's some way in which it could be made real, in which we can get people to understand and take seriously what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so there's some really interesting work going on in New Zealand around small island communities that are facing sea level rise on a scale that will, in the next 20 years, mean that whole communities, whole islands of communities are going to have to migrate off their islands. And New Zealand is ahead of the game here with this. So what we're looking at is climate change refugees in Pacific Islands, or sea level rise refugees, if that's what you want to call them. And one of the greatest losses for these people is their heritage. And I don't mean built heritage, I mean, songs, language, dance, things that are intangible, that when they are displaced as diaspora, how are they going to continue to practice that way of life? And one of the great things about New Zealand museums, and this is really, really amazing, actually, and it's just really beginning to take off now, is that the museum services in New Zealand are making spaces for people, not just their intangible heritage, but for them, for whole communities, to have space and place where they can be who, to become, to be, to live as they did in their island communities as they move out of their original places. So as they become migrants. And I think we're going to be looking at this more, I mean, this is going to become a real, something really big, I think, into this century, into the next 10, 20 years. And it will begin, of course, with Pacific Island communities and Atlantic Island communities where people have no choice but to move. And we as countries who are going to be the hosts of these populations, we are not just duty bound to host people, but we have to host people with their heritage and with their histories. And how we do that, we have to start thinking about now. And I think museums, as an archaeologist, I think museums have an enormous role to play. They are no longer going to be edifices of colonialism, but hopefully they're going to be active spaces of, you know, something, again, transformative. I see huge possibilities for museums in the future to help diasporas of people who are going to have to move, to do with particularly at the beginning sea level rise, but there will be other causes. Yeah.
That's a lovely vision, Joe. And one of the things which is great about it is it could really transform it for the better, this sort of slightly dusty image of museums, I think. Yeah. If it happens, I think
it's going to be amazing, and museums already see this. I think they're really starting to see the potential.
Good. Nick?
Yeah, I think just to answer Greg's question very briefly, I think the answer is clearly and obviously yes, because migration is one of the most robust sort of adaptation responses you see throughout history and prehistory. So certainly when people adapt, a lot of what they're doing is migrating. And I think more importantly, to build on what Joe was saying, we need to recognize that. And if we're going to, do transformational adaptation on, a bigger scale, globally, regionally, or whatever, we need to recognize that we have to enable and facilitate migration. It's not going to be something we can just see as something that should be stopped. We need to keep people in their places of origin or, wherever they are, because we don't want lots of people moving around. This is going to be inevitable, and it's the price we're paying for our sort of historical contribution to climate change. So and I think this is quite illustrative of the type of change and mindset we need. We need to start thinking, well, actually, migration will be the norm. We need to work out how we can manage it, not by stopping people moving, but by enabling, facilitating it, making it safer, making it better for the people who are doing the migrating and the people who then have to accommodate them. And that's what we need policy to start addressing. Unfortunately, it seems to be moving in the other direction, at least in this country and certainly in many other parts of the world, maybe in response to concerns over this sort of thing, but we need to turn that around for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm inclined to think that is a great moment to finish, because what the two of you have just done very nicely in response to that question is shown us a potential upside of down, a potential way in which we can and should turn the very difficult circumstance in which, if we're honest and authentic and prepared to look it in the face, our species is into something which could have some real upsides and could, in a way, even maybe be the making of us. So I'm going to use my executive authority to bring things to a close at that point. We've been going for 2 hours, which is pretty solid, especially on Zoom. Hopefully this time next year, we will be back having public lectures, at least mostly in person. Thanks very much for watching here this evening. Thanks to our sponsors, the Royal Institute for Philosophy. We hope very much you've enjoyed the series. Do catch up with the videos from earlier in the series and look out for the video from tonight, which will be coming out in a week or so. Do look in the chat for messages on how you can stay in touch with us. I'm now going to unmute everybody, or ask everybody to unmute, and invite you to join with me in thanking our speakers this evening and in thanking the organisers of the series. And this meeting will remain open for a few minutes afterwards. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I actually had the window off screen because I was actually doing some other stuff.
Thank you.